Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the One Thing podcast. We are here with Dr. Jamil Zaki, who is a professor of psychology at Stanford University and the director of the Stanford Social Neuroscience Lab, trained at Columbia and Harvard. Quite the resume, Dr. Zaki, and studying empathy and kindness in the human brain. He's interested in how we can learn to connect better, but specifically here to talk with us about his new book, dropping very soon, September 3rd, and it's called Hope for Cynics. Welcome, Jamil. We're excited to have you.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
I got to preview the book a bit, so thank you for that. And in the book, you talk about sort of this steady evolution that people are becoming more cynical, it sounds like. At some point, they believed that a majority of people believed that people were generally honest and good, and that's steadily declining. And in the book, you talk about the secret for sort of beating this back, the secret for minimizing the cynicism is what you call hopeful skepticism. Can you explain? I feel like it'll set the context for the rest of this conversation. Can you kind of explain what that is and what it means?
Yeah, this is a great place to start with some definitions. So let's go there. Cynicism, and this is not the ancient Greek school of philosophy, by the way, the modern psychological concept of cynicism is just a lack of faith in people. It's a theory that at our core, most of us are selfish, greedy, and dishonest. And it, as you said, has risen over time. In 1972, about half of Americans believed most people can be trusted. By 2018, that had fallen to a third of Americans, a drop as big as the stock market took during the financial collapse of 2008. So we are living through a trust deficit and a cynicism boom. And that's hurting us in a bunch of ways we can talk about if you like. But I think you're starting exactly in the right place, which is how do we separate that concept from skepticism? A lot of people think those are the same thing, and they are not, right? If cynicism is thinking like a lawyer, trying to prosecute humanity, right? Looking for evidence that we are bad in whatever way you want to conclude, skepticism means thinking like a scientist instead, not having blanket assumptions about people, not jumping to conclusions, but focusing on evidence instead, trying to learn from as much data as we can about what people are like. And it turns out that not only are these two things different, but skepticism can be an antidote to cynicism.
I'd be so curious to hear your perspective on, do you think that on really the why behind why this has evolved the way it has? Do you think that it's so much easier to get information now, so we're sort of flooded with news, whereas we used to not be? I always say there's an upside and a downside to this, because these days, if you're a company that does terrible things, you can't hide it like you used to. Like, then you will be found out now because information just travels so fast and people have access to everyone on social media, on the internet. And so that's got two sides to the coin, right? And I'd be curious your thoughts on how and why this has evolved.
It's a really interesting perspective you're sharing. I mean, first of all, when there is a trend in our psychology over time, it's impossible to know what caused it, because history is not an experiment, right? You can't run it 1,000 times and tinker with various factors. But I think you point to a great nominee here, which is the proliferation of information, global information into all of our screens all of the time. Now, I think it's interesting that you're pointing out that you can't hide things like corruption and crime, right? And that's probably a good thing. So if we're aware, if we're aware of wrongdoing, that's great. If we were ignorant to it in the past. And I think reporting over the last century has really uncovered so much that people are doing wrong and has held power to account. But I would, I guess, push back a little bit on the idea that all the information we're getting is accurate.
Yes.
In fact, I think there's a lot of evidence that the information we receive when we go to all of those various screens is not even, that we receive much more negative information than positive information. So yes, crime and corruption we see immediately. It's harder to get away with in a information saturated world. But guess what we're not seeing reported as much? Everyday goodness. People acting in trustworthy ways. You know, company CEO does right by his employees, doesn't really make the news. And so we end up with saturation of information, but maybe biased information that actually plays into our pre-existing psychological bias to focus on the negative anyways.
Yeah, I wonder is there, if you're looking at people at their core and you have, they're either inherently good or bad, is there some benefit to just accepting that there is like human nature, and accepting people for just humanity in general for its tendencies, and then going from there and growing from there to really accept that and be skeptical, like you said, versus cynical? And you mentioned like the flood of negative information, but it's just like orienting yourself on the fact that we have these kind of core traits as human beings and that we can evolve from that place.
I think it's a really interesting perspective. I would say that part of it is being more accepting of human nature, and but a second piece that is less acknowledged in our public conversations is that human nature is more changeable than we realize.
Mm,
It's very easy when somebody does something harmful to judge them full stop, that they are a bad person because of what they've done. It's much harder, but much more accurate to say this person did something maybe because of their traits, but also maybe because of the situation that they're in.
mm,
Think about it this way. If you're in a real hurry, you're late to an important medical appointment for your kid or something, you're in a huge rush, maybe you cut somebody off in traffic and you say, wow, I really don't like to do this, but I need to get to this appointment. You don't think of yourself as a bad person. You think about the situation you're in. If you're driving along and somebody else cuts you off in traffic, the last thing most of us do is say, I wonder if they're having a bad day. Maybe they're trying to get to an important medical appointment. We say, that person and everybody in their family can go straight you know where, right? I mean, so we often don't give each other the benefit of the doubt, even when people might deserve it.
Jamil, you sound like you've been driving with me. That's exactly what I sound like.
yeah, right. But Jamil, it's funny you use that example because just yesterday I was driving with my wife to the gym after work, and we're driving, and this woman like passed by us and was like flicking us off and all of this stuff, right? Like and my wife, which typically I would say she defaults towards, being frustrated with the person. She asked the question. She's like, I wonder what happened to her today that caused her to
Mm.
be in that mood. And I was like, wow, that's powerful. And I think like you said, it's a really healthy perspective to take, is just ask the question, be curious about why someone might be in that state.
Absolutely. And it's a generous way of thinking, but I want to highlight that it's also an accurate way of thinking.
Mm,
A lot of the research that I've done over the last few years has led me to understand, really for the first time as a person as well, that when we focus on more positive interpretations of people, we're not being naive or Pollyannish. That actually, if we don't do that, our default tendency is to focus so much on the negative that we're kind of naively cynical. We often, again, discount a lot of the data to just because we're on it. This traffic example, right? If we're driving along and somebody cuts us off, we'll remember that person all day, but we'll ignore the 100 or 1,000 people who obeyed traffic laws all around us, right? So we're filtering information in an asymmetric way. We are paying so much attention to the bad stuff, to the threats in our environment, to the worst things that people do, that we're actually quite wrong a lot of the time. And I guess, freedom and empowerment there is that being more hopeful is just a matter of trying to be a little bit less wrong.
mm,
Well, it sounds like this is sort of the practical application between cynicism and the hopeful skepticism that you talk about, right? That cynicism is the straight to that person's a jerk, and they can go where you said, and the other side, which is let me stop for a minute and think about what could have happened to them today, or maybe they're trying to get somewhere important, or I've done that before. Let me give grace to another human being to do it as well.
That's right, and it's harder work. Right? It's in a way cognitively easy to slip into our assumptions, to just judge people out of hand. It doesn't take a lot of work. It's more effort to be humble. It's more effort to be curious. But most things that are worthwhile take some effort.
mm.
Yes, very much so. I'd be curious, like what got you on this track, Jamil? Like what started the study of this in particular, of all the things that you could have studied and spent time on? Why this?
They say in psychology, research is me search, which means that you study something. You study something because it's mattered to you personally. And
Yeah.
this is definitely true for me. There's a secret that I reveal early in the book, which is that as you know, I've spent the last 20 years studying empathy, kindness, friendship, and connection, all these great things about humanity. But secretly, in private, I don't always see the best side in people myself. I'm a scientist of human goodness who defaulted to cynicism. And it's this major split between my professional life and how I feel a lot of the time. And it got worse during the early pandemic when we were all locked down.
Yeah.
I was experiencing humanity mostly on my computer, and that did not help. And I kind of started to ask myself, gosh, if I, given what I do for a living, am cynical, how does everybody else feel? And what can we do about this? So it was actually a somewhat of a personal journey to explore this topic that then evolved into just realizing how wrong so many of us are. And, it's an interesting thing, I guess, marinating myself for 3 years in the science of mistrust and suspicion and despair. You would think that I would be even more gloomy afterwards, but it made me much more hopeful because I realized how much goodness there is in other people that we don't notice. And I realized that through a practice of more careful noticing, pleasant surprises are everywhere.
I think your journey through this is so relatable because to some degree everybody is dealing with this, and I immediately go to like the two directional interpretation of this in an organization. Like as a leader, how many times I've either done this well or not done this well and how it's impacted me, and then as a team member looking at the organization with that same lens, like how you've have had a cynical or non-cynical or healthy skeptical approach towards like why an organization is moving the way it's moving. And I can see how this dynamic is it's healthy in both directions.
Absolutely. And, it's healthy to be skeptical in a bunch of different domains, and it's unhealthy to be cynical in a whole bunch of different domains. Cynicism is terrible for our personal health, our relationships, our communities. It's also really bad for our workplaces and organizations. There's a whole bunch of research on organizational cynicism, which is people's belief that in the context of my workplace, most people are out for themselves.
Mm.
And you find over and over again that when people are cynical about their workplace, they feel worse. That's really awful for people's morale, their mental health, their loyalty to the organization. But they also do poorly. People who are cynical about their organization are less willing to take creative risks. They're less
Mm.
willing to share knowledge and skills with one another, to collaborate efficiently. And ultimately, they're more likely to leave their jobs. So it's interesting to me that a lot of leaders think that in order to motivate people, you need to tap into their selfish desires and fears, when actually that's counterproductive, even at a bottom line level.
Do you feel like cynicism is like it's like it can gain momentum? Like it's like an organism that if you feed it grows. Like personally, but even in teams and groups, like it almost gets reinforced when you start to do it and feed on itself.
100%. And I would say that it actually grows. If we're thinking about it as an organism, I would think of it as a very effective parasitic organism.
Like
One
cancer.
that grows, yes, yeah, one that grows very quickly using the material around it. So
Mm.
there's research that finds that one cynical member in an organization can have much more impact in creating more cynicism than one hopeful or positive person can have, right? And
Mm.
so we need to be really careful of that in our workplaces and as leaders. One thing that I find oftentimes when I work with organizations is that people focus so much on that one cynical, toxic colleague that they overestimate how much other people in their workplace agree with that person. So we actually end up not just cynical about our organizations, but wrong about who's in them and what our colleagues want.
Mm.
Well, do you find that often paired with sort of this extreme cynicism, there's often a louder voice, like that people tend to be inclined to share that cynicism more loudly than the person who may be inclined to fall more on the hopeful skeptic side?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that one of the issues with cynicism is that it's not only a pattern of thought, but it's also a habit of speech. And I think in general, it's not just cynical people, but rather more extreme people who tend to rise to the top of our cultural conversations, right? If you look at the loudest folks in the room, they're often not they don't represent the majority, and they don't represent the majority in a systematic way, which is that they're often more negative, right? People love giving 1-star Yelp reviews to life and their communities and humanity. And we hear those people loud and clear, and then again, overestimate because they're dominating so much our conversations. We often don't realize that, hey, we're in a quiet majority that is the exact opposite of this person. One of the things that I do when I consult with organizations on building more trust and empathy is I'll start with an anonymous survey of everyone in the organization. And I'll say, how much do you want collaboration, trust, empathy, so forth, to be at the center of your workplace? And two, how do you think the average person in your company would answer that same question? And every single organization, every community, I mean, I've done this in schools and hospitals as well, that I survey, you get two realities. The first one is what people really want, and it's basically at the top of the scale. People want, more than almost anything in their workplace, a sense of connection to their colleagues. The second reality is what people think their average colleague wants, which is much less of those same values. And so I'll start my talks or workshops with, hey, I collected some data from you. Look around, right? Here's what the people in this room want. 95% of you want more collaboration, more cooperation, more trust and empathy in your workplace. So if you want that too, you're part of a super majority. And I find that when we can see each other and our organizations more accurately, it can be empowering and, yes, more hopeful as well.
Well, I know this is specifically what you work with organizations on. I know you were telling us before we started recording that you just wrote a Harvard Business Review piece around this. And I'd love if you could touch on, if you're a leader, and I think a lot of leaders might translate, and I'd love your perspective on this too, might translate this cynicism for negativity, right? I've got a lot of negativity in my organization. But what are some of the things that people can actually do to move towards the side of hopeful skepticism? Like, how can you actually create this inside an organization?
Yeah, this is one place where I think knowledge is power. So oftentimes, cynics at work want to gain traction. They want to be leaders. They want to succeed just like everybody else, but they have the wrong model of what success is. If you take a cynical worldview and think everybody's selfish, well, the only way to succeed is to compete, to fight the people around you, to step over or on your colleagues to get to the top. It turns out that that's the wrong game to be playing. Research finds that people actually succeed and rise to leadership positions when they can build coalitions, partnerships, trusting relationships. And so I think educating people about, hey, you might think that you have to work this way to succeed, but you don't. That's a powerful first step. A second step is for leaders to make that true on the ground. Right? If you tell people, hey, we believe in empathy and trust here, but then you reward them only for their individual performance, you're actually sending mixed signals, right? You're incentivizing selfishness and talking about empathy. That's not going to work. What I encourage people to do, and I think more organizations are doing this now, is to reward people more holistically, not just for what they do as individuals, but for how they show up for their colleagues. Create systems and structures where people thrive through collaboration, where their outcomes are dependent on one another's. And if you intertwine people's fate and destiny in that way, they naturally come together and cooperate. The better parts of them, I suppose, the kinder parts of them float to the surface because that's what the environment demands.
Yeah, organizationally, you kind of have to signal that to make it true, like you said. And then as a leader, I think I guess I should ask you, do you think you should look for like specific examples of where you could demonstrate that behavior? Because perhaps you have someone on your team, like you said, they maybe haven't seen this success. They've been in other places or on teams where it was, more of the cynical kind of individual approach that they felt was the right model. But to change that model, you have to demonstrate the behavior and find those examples of where you can do it.
Yeah, it's a great point. George Carlin said, scratch a cynic and you'll find a disappointed idealist. As a former cynic myself, I have nothing but compassion and solidarity for people who feel this way. And I think oftentimes People are not cynical because they hate humanity. They're cynical because they want to feel safe. Maybe they've been betrayed in the past, even traumatized, and you start to close off, put up those walls so that people don't take advantage of you again. So when somebody in my life, including in my own tiny organization, my laboratory, if somebody seems suspicious and cynical, I try not to meet that with more cynicism, but rather with curiosity and openness and say, tell me about where you worked before. What was it like? And oftentimes you'll see that people, as you're saying, came from a place where they couldn't trust because the organization really was self-oriented and competitive. And I think it takes a while and it takes strong signals to show somebody, hey, here you can act differently. Here you're safe. One of the ways to start that process is to trust people, right? If you want to get trust from folks, you need to give it first often, right? And it turns out that in workplaces, when people feel that their manager has faith in them, they're much more likely to, in turn, trust their manager and trust their colleagues. So sometimes we need to give to others what we want to get in response.
Well, to your point, I think where you can start to show compassion is that's just a really hard place to live. Like being in that space of the way you just describe it, I sort of got a pang in my heart of like, wow, this has got to be a really hard way to show up. It's got to be really hard to start a job assuming that your boss is going to be a jerk or that everybody is out for themselves. I mean, we have to have compassion for the person who lives there, and yet we can see how they may have arrived there. I'd love if you could talk more, Jamil, about how someone could potentially see sort of the symptoms of this in their organization. Like, how much that this is something that's starting to become a problem for you?
Well, I mean, you can ask people, first of all. There are questionnaires on organizational cynicism. In fact, when I ask people, how much does the average person in your organization want collaboration, kindness, and trust, if they answer not very much, if they think that the average person wants competition, that's a self-report sign of cynicism. But you can also examine cynicism through people's behaviors. Are they sharing knowledge with others? Are they open with with their skills? Are they generous to their colleagues? Are they giving? And then second, are they asking? Are they being vulnerable towards others? If they need help, do they feel like they can turn to the person next to them and ask for it? Or are they closed off? I've seen some psychologists actually use Slack messages as a sign of trust in an organization. That is, you can see the number of messages that sort of go through an organization. And if people are very siloed, if they're only sending messages to the people on their team and not at all across teams, it might be a sign that they don't trust the people in other parts of the organization. If there's much more of a cohesive, sort of single social network that you see in Slack messages, it suggests that people are more interconnected and maybe more trusting as well.
No, that's interesting. It gives you like Slack gives you like a god's eye view on the communication tendencies of the overall organization.
Exactly. Exactly.
So somebody's listening to this, and I'm sure they find themselves immediately kind of zooming in on a current relationship they have inside of an organization, and they're like, "Oh, I have this kind of perpetuating cynical thing going on with this person." And I'm sure you've had this experience, but sometimes those get like kind of galvanized, right? And like you almost feel like you're stuck in like this cycle with somebody where it reciprocates back this cynicism. Is there anything maybe more tactical to do or be aware of as a person in a relationship like that where you want to right the ship?
Yeah, a bunch of things. The first would be to uh, try to assess what happened, diagnose where this came from. This is related to what we were sharing earlier, that when we see that pattern, we need to be compassionate towards it, both towards the other person's cynicism, but also towards our own. Let's not judge ourselves or other people. Second, I think we can try to take what I would call, again, a leap of faith on somebody else, to give them more of a chance to
Mm.
show us who they are, a reset to the relationship. I find that, well, it's not just what I find. The data find that when we treat people cynically, we bring out their worst. And when we treat people with trust, we actually bring out their best. So we don't just learn about somebody, but we change them. One thing that I try to do and encourage others to do is to trust loudly. So not just to put faith in somebody, but to tell them you're doing that. And it can feel cringe, let's be honest, to say, hey, I feel like we've been a little bit off on the wrong foot with this relationship. I just want you to know that I'd like for things to improve, and I'd like to, and I really, I believe in you. So I'd like to, so I'm going to put faith in you in this way, right? It can feel like, wow, that's a lot. But actually, the data are clear that we often don't communicate enough our intentions. And when you have positive intent towards another person, saying so might be hard. It might feel embarrassing, but it's probably much more powerful than you think. And then the last thing that I'll say about this is that oftentimes to reset relationships and especially sort of turn a toxic cycle into a virtuous one, uh, you can start with questions, right? So curiosity is really rare in the face of conflict, but it
Mhm.
can be very disarming. It can de-escalate conflict a lot. If you say, look, I feel like we've been having some sort of problems, or our relationship hasn't really been as strong as it could be at work. I just want to know what you're experiencing. Can you tell me where you're coming from? Showing genuine curiosity, even in the face of big disagreement and conflict, can diffuse the situation shockingly quickly.
Yeah. And being like truly authentic in your curiosity, like you said, genuine. But I think you can do it surface level, but if you aren't truly committed to it, it just reads off the wrong way.
100%. That's right.
Well, I
Mm.
think it also always takes one. Someone has to put their ego, their pride, whatever it may be, aside to say, I'm going to lead this initiative and lead this conversation to go down a different path, which I think when you're a cynic can be, if you have two cynical people communicating, especially,
Mhm.
can probably be really challenging because
Mhm.
I'm walking into that conversation assuming that the other person has the worst intent. And if I do this and they don't immediately change their behavior, which we often don't, it probably will take them a while to change it. Then we might. I could see a person falling right back into the, well, I told you it wouldn't work. Do you see that?
Yes, we do. I mean, that's everywhere in the data. And let's be clear: if you've been in a conflict and you decide to take the first step to open up, the person that you're talking with might not reciprocate. They might say, "Fine, I still don't trust you. I still don't want to work with you," and you'll feel burned, and that's a
Yeah.
completely normal experience. And it's 100% valid to feel disappointed in people when they let us down. What the cynic does is turn that disappointment into what I would call pre-disappointment. That is, they don't just feel bad about the person who's betrayed them. They draw a global conclusion that everybody will betray me. And that's where we start to make big mistakes.
Mm.
Of course, people will let us down. You haven't lived a life on earth if nobody has let you down. But if your response to that is to go into a defensive crouch, to put up your walls super high so that nobody ever can possibly take advantage of you, you will be safe in a very narrow definition of safety. But really, you'll be cutting yourself off from opportunities for collaboration, friendship, and connection. Really, so much of what makes life worthwhile.
So how does the hopeful skeptic approach that?
Yeah, so there's this great term from economics, trust but verify. The idea is to start with, again, a hopeful perspective. This is not naive hope, but rather saying, it turns out that probably most people are more trustworthy than I realize. Most people are more open-minded than I realize. So let me give a new person the benefit of the doubt. One, because that's probably correct more often than not. But two, because as we've talked about, giving that person the benefit of the doubt makes it much more likely that they'll do the same for me, that they'll trust me, and that their most collaborative, kind side will come out, will emerge from that interaction. That's step one. Step two is to pay close attention to the data that you receive in return, right? If you put your best foot forward, take a leap of faith on somebody, and they, slam the door in your face, you don't have to do that again. You've just received the data that you need for that moment in time. Now you can choose to say, maybe that person was having a bad day, I'll give them another shot, but at least you've learned about them. But if the person does reciprocate, make sure you learn from that too. I think we often learn super well from betrayal and not well enough from positive interactions. So though that sort of trust but verify framework, I think, is really powerful. for being skeptical, not naive, not a chump, but still taking advantage of the countless opportunities we have to connect more deeply.
And as you mentioned before, like keep that macro perspective that this one interaction or example isn't representative of the whole picture or of an entire organization. And then also there's probably some unique circumstance that led that person to be there. And it's not that they are that person necessarily.
Exactly. That's right. It's sort of, again, this wise perspective on other people as not fixed, but malleable and changeable. And so if somebody mistreated you in the past, A, you do not have to, you don't owe it to them to put yourself in that situation again. But if you do, you might be surprised that they're actually different than they were in the past.
Mm.
Well, and I think the importance here is also understanding to that point that people can change. I might have caught someone at a bad time. I know I always think of an example of someone I worked with very early on in my career who was just awful and a real challenge to interact with amongst the entire company. And I happened to work with them many years later, about a decade later, and it could have been an entirely different person.
Wow.
I wouldn't have believed it had I not personally had both interactions. And it turns out they were going through a really challenging lifetime. And I'll admit that there was a lot of cynic in me that approached the relationship at first that this was going to be the person I remembered. And through their own efforts and their own, I'm sure, very, very pointed focus on showing up differently, I was proven wrong. And eventually we built a great relationship. And so much of this has to do with where someone may be in that moment, or obviously up with the overarching company culture is, because I think that can change somebody's behavior quite a bit as well.
What a powerful story. And, I think it speaks to the idea that, look, I don't think it's wise to wait for people to change, to count on them changing, or necessarily to try to change them ourselves. Everybody is on their own journey, and we can't control where somebody's will go. But we can at least be curious about where they're headed, right? We don't need to make a snap judgment based on one moment in a person's life and pretend like we can tell the future, because we can't. The future is really unpredictable, often in quite beautiful ways. And to allow ourselves to say, well, let me just keep on paying attention, right? That allows us to see somebody change over time if they do, and to give them a chance when they deserve it.
Yeah. It's like create the opportunity for that growth to happen or that relationship to strengthen, but it's not your responsibility necessarily to impart that change in someone else.
That's right.
Jamil, I think you do such a beautiful job in the book, which I'm excited for people to get their hands on, but you do such a beautiful job sort of marrying the science behind this, the actual research, and a lot of stories. I'd love if there was a story that's sort of your favorite example of hopeful skepticism at work.
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Yeah. I'll talk about a leader in an organization that's maybe different from some of your listeners. This is LaJuan White, who was a principal in Brooklyn. She got reassigned to a school in Syracuse called Lincoln Middle School. She looked it up, and I mean, this place was terrifying. It was, as middle school was. It certainly was a terrifying place for me when I was.
I say middle schoolers terrify me too. To be fair,
always have, always will,
always will.
But this place, was legitimately. I mean, it was in New York State's list of persistently dangerous schools, which is you get on that list by having a bunch of violent incidents every year. It's in a very low income area. And it had chewed up and spit out 4 principals over a 5-year span before LaJuan White arrived. So you can imagine that there was a lot of cynicism in this organization. And what White discovered when she got there was that it wasn't that the kids were terrible. A lot of them were struggling. A lot of them had really hard times. And a lot of them were acting out.
Yeah.
But she saw that teachers had this relatively knee-jerk response, what she called a punishment culture. When a student would act out, a teacher's first impulse was, let me get that kid out of the classroom. They're a threat. They're a bad kid. I want to suspend them or even expel them because they're a harmful element to the classroom. that's a really, I think, understandable if you're stressed, you're managing so many kids and somebody's acting in a violent way. I mean, it makes perfect sense, or they're disrupting the class. I understand where teachers are coming from. So did LaJuan White. But she said, well, let's try to be curious instead. So she did a porch tour. She went to the homes of some of these kids that were quote unquote troublemakers. And in many cases, she saw that their home lives were devastatingly difficult, poor, unregulated. They were the sort of adult in the house at whatever, 11 or 12 years old. And that gave her this deep sense of compassion for those kids. She realized sometimes they were hungry or they hadn't slept because it was too cold and their home didn't have heat. Once she flipped that switch and turned to understanding, she came up with a new idea for how the school could operate, what she calls restorative justice. This is the idea that when somebody acts in a harmful manner, you don't want to immediately judge them. You want to be curious about them and set up opportunities for the relationships that they have hurt to heal. And this was very challenging for teachers. They did not like when LaJuan White told them that they would have to do this, but she cooperated with them to generate this new form of empathic discipline. And it turns out that it worked. Rates of violent incidents fell dramatically in the school, suspension rates fell. The school was taken off of New York's persistently dangerous list and stayed there. And when I asked her to sum up her strategy, she said, I decided to treat kids like the people we hope they are instead of the people we fear they are. And
Mm.
that to me was incredibly powerful because it shows that, especially if you're in a leadership position, your willingness to see the best in people will really bring that best side out.
It's such a relatable.
Beautiful.
I mean, you said it might be different than the audience, but I think it's one to one. Like there's no difference in that approach and what she was trying to accomplish there than what we would try to do in an organization or with people. We're still people, just a little
Yeah.
older, maybe some in like complexity and some walls built up, but still at our core, we face the same challenges.
Absolutely.
Well, I think it's also a bit ironic for me as someone who has kids. I think it's interesting because often with children, we expect them to behave a certain way. We expect them to show up a certain way and don't take into account what is happening at home life or happening with their stress or their hormones or all the things that can cause behavioral anomalies, right? And yet as adults, we will show up that way and expect that everyone has compassion for our home life or our hormones or whatever may be happening. And I've always found that to be a very interesting dichotomy that adults have in how they show up in the world and how we approach children who just quite simply don't have the tools to communicate these things. And what a beautiful story and example of what happens when you not only give them the tools, but have a bit of compassion around what it is that they're experiencing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I mean, kids, as a parent of two young kids, it's remarkable. We expect kids to quote unquote behave, but their inner life is really complicated and sometimes it's harder for them to regulate. And also, kids don't have that much autonomy. And sometimes we don't give them that much autonomy. We want our kids to trust us and to trust the world, but we often don't trust them to make their own decisions. I'm not saying that I should let my 8 and 7-year-old pick what they want for dinner. They would just eat ice cream sundaes every day and end up with a stomach ache. But there are other places that we can try to instill more trust, even in the young people in our lives. My late colleague and friend, Emile Bruneau, talked about this as underbearing attentiveness, where you are there, present with a child, but also not micromanaging them. You are letting them discover who they want to be. You're showing great faith in them. And it turns out that when we put faith in kids, they're more likely to trust us to do better in school. I mean, when kids feel trusted, they trust. And this idea of underbearing attentiveness, Emile then brought to his life as a coach when he was a coach of a rugby team, and they did spectacularly well. And I think we can bring it to our role as leaders as well. Oftentimes we feel like we want control over the people who work with and for us. Like, we want to feel safe. We don't want them to screw up, and then it's us who are on the hook. But when we try to manage people too tightly, we actually take away their autonomy. And I try more and more in my own management of my PhD students to have underbearing attentiveness as a North Star.
Well, I think the beautiful example with young children is that we've talked about creating trust in organizations and creating trust in each other, but this gives them the opportunity to create trust in themselves too, which is, I think, where all of this starts.
That's beautifully put.
We always ask, Jamil, at the end of this podcast, what's the one thing that you would want listeners to take away from this conversation?
Hope is criminally underrated. It's a remarkable moment that we're in where we've not only become more cynical, but we've glamorized cynicism as wise and safe and even moral. And we think of hope as wearing a pair of rose-colored glasses, ignoring real problems in the world. It turns out that basically the opposite is true, that it's often our cynicism about each other that's naive. And being hopeful then isn't a matter of putting on a pair of rose-colored glasses. Most of us are wearing a pair of mud-colored glasses right now. We just don't know it. And being hopeful is just a matter of taking those off and seeing the world and each other more clearly.
Well, I don't know about everybody listening, but I feel lighter after this conversation, which I think is a testament to how important this work is and this conversation is, because cynicism just feels heavy to me. It feels like a lot to carry around. So thank you for imparting your wisdom on us today and on the listeners. If people want to connect with you, Jamil, where can they find you?
I am at jamil-zaki.com. That's my personal website. My lab at Stanford, the Stanford Social Neuroscience Lab, ssnl.stanford.edu. And my book, Hope for Cynics, The Surprising Science of Human Goodness, is available wherever you get books.
Thank you so much for being here today, and we'll see everybody next time.
Thank you. This was delightful.